We're live.
Hello, fellow listeners. Welcome back to those who have been with us from the start, and a warm welcome to first comers. Our edition tonight of Socialist Action Webcasts is now started. My name is Elizabeth Bice, and I am the Federal Treasurer of Socialist Action, a member of the NDP Socialist Caucus Steering Committee. We acknowledge that this event is taking place on Indigenous lands across Turtle Island known as North America. That includes the unceded territories of the Mississaugas, of the Nukret, the Wendat, and Haudenosaunee people in the place called Toronto. Today, I'm speaking to you from Jamaica, where the indigenous Taino and Arawak-speaking people began arriving here over 4,000 years ago, but were wiped out by European colonial powers. We join in the fight for justice, recognizing that there can be no real reconciliation without restitution. That entails seizing the assets of the big resource corporation and returning them to the commons. Tonight's topic is the 100th anniversary of the communist movement in Canada, featuring John Riddell, socialist activist and historian, and Barry Weisletter, Federal Secretary of Socialist Action. John will speak for about 25 minutes and Barry for about 12. After that, we will take questions written into the chat column from the online audience. So let's begin. John Riddell is the author of several books on the Communist International in the 1920s. John was a leader of our predecessor organization, the League for Socialist Action, in the 1970s. Today, he contributes to solidarity with Palestine and Venezuela and is a supporter of socialist action. Welcome, John. Unmute yourself, John.
Okay.
Okay.
Okay, hello everybody, and it's nice to be with Socialist Action again today. Now, 10 days from today, we will celebrate the centennial of the communist movement in Canada. It was born on May 23rd, 1921, at a one-day secret conference of 22 comrades at a farm owned by Fred Farley, close to Guelph, Ontario. Now, since that day, this movement, now more frequently termed revolutionary socialism, has continued through a line of continuity that includes today's Socialist Action Canada. So, comrades of Socialist Action, you have every right to celebrate May 23rd as the centennial of your organization. Now, this story is well told in a book by Ian Angus called Canadian Bolsheviks, upon which this presentation is based. And his very fine study remains in print. That's Canadian Bolsheviks. The founders of the Communist Party of Canada explained the significance of this event, their foundation, as follows. Ours will be a party of action, seeking contact with the workers, a party in which the theorists and doctrinaires as such will find small place, a party of workers, with them in their daily struggles against capitalist oppression, seeking always to build up a united front of the working class for industrial freedom and emancipation from wage slavery. Before the birth of communism, socialist forces in Canada were divided into three currents. The Social Democratic Party of Canada was based in Ontario and took inspiration from the movement of that name in Europe. It was oriented to electoral action. Under the shock of the First World War, the Social Democrats broke apart. The second party, the Socialist Party of Canada, by contrast, was based in the Western provinces. And it was radical, labor-based, and sectarian. It was a combination of militant unionists and abstract theoreticians. As early as 1916, before the Russian Revolution, the Socialist Party of Canada called for a new revolutionary international. But when the Communist International was founded in 1919, the Socialist Party characteristically refused to join. Both the Social Democratic and Socialist parties in Canada had a strong following among immigrant workers from Europe, but they lacked support from Francophones. They had a couple of thousand members each, but it was a third group, the much smaller Socialist Party of North America, that led the way in fusing the various revolutionary socialist forces into a communist party. When Canada's government joined the First World War on Britain's side in 1914, it launched a campaign of repression aimed at immigrant communities and also at socialist labor and left activists. Unions fell into decline, but beginning in 1917, workers' struggles revived in Canada. Socialist groups began to grow. Opposition to Canada's imperialist war became more widespread. Anti-war sentiment found expression that year in massive protests against military conscription. Socialists had many ties to the radical farmers' movement at that time. Meanwhile, among French-speaking Quebecers, there was a strong protest against military conscription. And this mass movement came close to insurrection. The socialist movement, weak in Quebec, played no significant role in this movement, nor did it engage in major solidarity efforts on behalf of the indigenous population victimized by deprivation and forced assimilation. It was a half-century before revolutionary socialists in Canada in 1970, members of the League for Socialist Action, published a major statement written by Richard Fiddler in support of Indigenous land rights and sovereignty. Meanwhile, socialists in Canada saw an inspiring light in the East. In February 1917, a worker-peasant uprising in Russia overthrew the Tsar, who had forced a great many of them into immigration. The socialist press in Canada followed the Russian news closely, printing its first major analysis in June, an article by a Russian Marxist, Gregory Chicherin, then in exile in Britain. 6 months later, Chicherin was a member of the Bolshevik government in Petrograd. As a Winnipeg socialist commented a few years later, the overthrow of Tsarism was the greatest stimulus the workers of the world have ever received. And now let me quote how a Socialist Party member in Vancouver recalled his personal reaction when, in October 1917, the Bolshevik Party led the establishment in Russia of a workers' Soviet republic. The speaker is Malcolm Bruce. And Malcolm said, "It was like a bolt out of the blue, like a blinding light when the news came over of the overthrow of the government by the Bolsheviks and the establishment of the Soviet Republic. There was a great uplift amongst the working class. At last they saw that the working class rose in their might and took over the power of a powerful nation, and they wondered if it couldn't be done here." Charlie Lesto, who was perhaps the greatest lecturer and propagandist they had in the Socialist Party of Canada, said, "Malcolm, this is it. This is the beginning of the world revolution." And there you have it. Many decades later, Malcolm Bruce was a co-founder of the League for Socialist Action, the predecessor of today's Socialist Action Canada. Two other participants in the League for Socialist Action Foundation are present at today's meeting: John Wilson and myself. Now that's a measure of how close we are in human terms to the foundation of revolutionary socialism in Canada. In 1919, a group was formed in Toronto that took the name Communist Party of Canada. It did not last, and its existence has been all but forgotten. The pioneer revolutionary socialists of Canada were far from understanding Bolshevik politics. By and large, they were sectarian in orientation. The meaning of that term is well displayed by a leaflet distributed by an early communist group in June 1919, when workers in Toronto went out in a great general strike. Communist support to the strike was faint indeed. The Communist Party of Canada, they declared, is not opposed to your strike. The leaflet continued. You machinists who made so many splendid guns, rifles, and arms for your masters to sell, why did you neglect to provide yourselves with them before you struck? If you had done that, you would not be at the mercy of a gang of policemen. The time is ripe for the battle for power. The workers will respond if you give the signal. Such sectarianism towards the Great Strike was a dead end. It took a major struggle for the movement to reorient toward the politics of the Bolsheviks in Russia. The lead in that process was taken by the Socialist Party of North America. With 100 members, it was by far the smallest socialist group, but was politically closer to the positions of the Bolsheviks in Russia. Revolutionary socialists in Canada got assistance from the Communist International, or Comintern, launched in Moscow in March 1919. They were influenced by Lenin's 1920 pamphlet on left-wing communism, by the resolutions of the Second Comintern Congress that year, in 1920, and of the Third Congress in 1921. And the Third Congress was the first attended by a delegate from Canada, Joan Knight. The process was recalled a few years later by Florence Custance, a remarkable woman, a leader of the Communist Party and its work among women. Here's how she described the transformation, and it's worth quoting at length. After a heated and bitter discussion, Custance tells us, the party adopted a policy that was a departure from the former strictly doctrinaire attitude. First, this new party policy insisted upon the necessity of work in the trade unions, and that work in this connection must be considered in the light of the class struggle activity and not merely as a pure, simple wages question deserving only theoretical treatment. Second, it recognized the usefulness of the general strike in the process of revolutionary struggle. Third, it insisted that parliamentarism, that is, conventional electoral activity, had its limitations, and that the class struggle could not be confined within its narrow scope. And fourth, it recognized the need for armed insurrection for the establishment of workers' power and rule. The final point on insurrection, in my opinion, reflected the degree of misunderstanding of how workers' power was achieved in Russia. See on my blog an article called Defensive Formulations and the Organization of Action, which presents the comments of Custance's comrade in the United States, James P. Cannon. Nonetheless, on the whole, Custance gives us a remarkably condensed summary of the ways in which the communist movement represented a new type of political party not previously found on Canada's left. Canada's communists saw the Revolutionary Party as a part of an international proletarian army and a leading force in a coordinated working class action across the country. Now, this process of revolutionary regroupment was disrupted by a panicky attempt by the Ottawa government to illegalize the entire socialist left. All socialist meetings were banned, as was any public discussion conducted in any of the languages spoken within Russia. A vast array of books were banned, including Plato's Republic, of all things. Many supporters of the Kuomintang, the Chinese bourgeois nationalist movement led by Sun Yat-sen, were rounded up and jailed, along with many socialist immigrants from a variety of countries. The response was a massive protest movement for free speech. Socialists in Canada, unable to hold meetings in their own name, would attend meetings of rival political currents, take control of the meetings, take over the platform, and boldly present their views. Meanwhile, the labor movement in Canada rose in 1919 in a massive upsurge of struggles, among which was the Winnipeg General Strike, which you discussed in this forum. The revolutionary left took leadership of labor west of Ontario and formed a radical labor federation called One Big Union. The experience of this great workers' upsurge of 1919 attracted many new militants into the communist movement. The party's founding convention in 1921 was harmonious and finished its business in a single day, but the newly fused party was largely limited to Ontario. To the west, revolutionary socialists were mainly organized by the Socialist Party, whose members had led the 1919 Western labor upsurge. The Western Socialists opened a debate that lasted for a year. One by one, the Socialist Party local groups joined the Communist Party. The Socialist Party collapsed, and in 1925 it dissolved. So we're getting there. That leaves Quebec, an important story that is not found in Ian Angus's book. The following is based on a recent interview with him. The communist movement in Quebec was organized in Montreal late in 1921 by a remarkable worker activist named Albert Saint-Martin. His group was politically ultra-leftist, similar to the approach of other communist movements in North America at that time. But he had no contact with them and missed out on their evolution later that year to support of a united front approach. The following year, members of the Montreal group went to Toronto and established a relationship with the Communist Party while retaining their ultra-left positions. Once back in Montreal, they sent a letter to Moscow to the Soviet Commissar of Foreign Relations, Gregory Chicherin, he turns up again, asking for recognition as the Communist Party of Quebec, which they proposed would be a genuine communist organization, in contrast to the bunch of opportunist reformists in the Communist Party of Canada, as they saw it. They sought recognition as a separate Quebec party, not for nationalist reasons, but as an expression of ultra-leftism. The Soviet Foreign Ministry reacted with alarm. The Montreal Initiative was compromising their foreign policy operations. They asked for an explanation, and the party in Canada responded by sending a delegation to Montreal to meet with the Quebec communists. They had a debate with Albert Saint-Martin. The outcome, about half the Montreal group joined the Communist Party of Canada. The other half stood with Saint-Martin in staying aloof. Saint-Martin went on to form the Université Ouvrière, which played an idiosyncratic but energetic role in the Montreal workers' movement until it was banned by the provincial government in the mid-1930s for the crime of blasphemy. Why blasphemy? Well, just ask me. This short talk cannot summarize the Communist Party's political achievements, but let me just note that it had an important experience in supporting and helping to sustain the Canadian Labour Party. Launched by Canada's main trade union federation in 1917, the Labour Party had modest success. The Communists joined the Labour Party and played a leading role in it. The Labour Party declined during the Union's retreat during the 1920s. Its remnants affiliated to the Social Democratic CCF in 1935, which in turn merged into the NDP. After a promising start, the Communist Party declined under the pressure of the labor retreat in the mid and late 1920s and the rise of Stalinism in the Communist International. Among the founding leaders of the Political Bureau, two central figures, Jack MacDonald and Morris Spector, joined the revolutionary Marxist opposition to Stalinism led by Leon Trotsky. So too did other members of the leadership, Jack Kavanaugh, Max Armstrong, and Malcolm Bruce. On the other hand, Florence Custance and Becky Bouhet, Mike Bouhet, and William Moriarty, all members of the leadership, joined the so-called right opposition to Stalinism, led by Nikolai Bukharin. All were expelled or driven out of the Communist Party by the Stalinist forces. The only remaining original leader, a Stalin loyalist named Tim Buck, took over the party leadership. It was left to the dissident communists to carry on in various ways and in various forms the genuine heritage of the Russian Revolution and of the Communist Party of Lenin's time, whose centennial we are celebrating this evening. And thank you very much.
Thank you, John. Thank you so much. Okay, our next speaker is Barry Weisletter. He's a retired teacher, a union organizer, co-chair of the NDP Socialist Caucus, and a member of the editorial board of Socialist Action newspaper and Turn Left magazine. He is the federal secretary of Socialist Action League for Action Socialists. Welcome, Barry.
Good evening, comrades and friends. And thanks very much to John for his wonderful historical overview of the formation of the communist movement in Canada. It's important to emphasize the context in which the Canadian communist movement arose. It was inspired by the Russian Revolution, as John made quite clear, which was besieged by hostile imperialist armies. Russia suffered enormously from its isolation and economic backwardness. A bureaucratic party elite, represented by Joseph Stalin, seized control of the apparatus. It curtailed workers' democracy, it crushed socialist opposition, and adopted a new program that over-adapted to capitalist rule outside the USSR. The perspective of world revolution was replaced with the false utopia of socialism in one country. Permanent revolution, that is, the need for a workers-led revolution to lead the social transformation, especially in the poor countries, was supplanted. It was supplanted by the old, discredited Menshevik notion of revolution by stages. The stages theory relies on an alliance with the liberal or nationalist bourgeoisie. Under Stalin, socialist democracy was replaced by bureaucratic tyranny, accompanied by elite privilege, false propaganda, show trials, torture, and the assassination of political opponents. The degeneration of the Stalinist-dominated Communist International gave rise to the International Left Opposition in 1930 and to the formation of the Fourth International in 1938. Leon Trotsky, co-leader with Lenin of the Russian Revolution, played a leading role in the preservation of revolutionary Marxism and its further development. Trotsky's analysis of the phenomenon of Stalinism and the phenomenon of fascism in the 20th century was particularly significant. So, what about the granddaddy of the radical left, the Communist Party today? John's talk brought us up to the 30s. A lot's happened since then. The Communist Party is reformist, and it is Canadian nationalist to the core. It strives for a multi-class or popular front government. The Popular Front, as opposed to the Workers' United Front, subordinates workers' parties to capitalist parties in the pursuit of political power. In Canada, the Popular Front idea includes the, quote, the progressive wing, quote, of the Liberal Party. It incorporates the mistaken view, also held by Communist Party of Canada Marxist-Leninists, that Canadian nationalism is progressive. While the CP admits that the Canadian state is an imperialist power in its own right, after all, it's hard to ignore the role of giant Canadian banks, mining corporations, and the Canadian military as part of the North Atlantic Treaty Alliance, NATO. The Stalinists are still pining for an alliance with a wing of the Liberal Party. The CP supported the power bid by the combination of Liberals, the NDP, and the Bloc Québécois in December 2008. In fact, the Communist Party wanted to be part of it. But Stephen Harper killed their dream by proroguing Parliament twice and winning the election in May 2011. The Communist Party is a shell of its storied past. It is both unwilling and unable to account for the sad legacy of Stalinist sexism, homophobia, treachery, and political repression. It supported the crushing by the Soviet Union of the Workers' Rebellion in Hungary in 1956 and in Czechoslovakia in 1968. The Cuban Stalinists opposed Fidel Castro, Che Guevara, and the Cuban insurgency up to the last few weeks in 1958, switching to support them only when it appeared that the Cuban revolutionaries were about to win. The League for Socialist Action played a leading role in establishing the Fair Play for Cuba Committee, an anti-imperialist united front which the Stalinists in Canada and Cuba sought to undermine and vilify. Yeah, there was a Stalinist party in Cuba, the PSP, the Socialist Popular Party. It was in opposition and was outside the July 26th movement, which led the revolution. At any rate, a chapter in the book Revolutionary Activism in the 1950s and 60s by Ernie Tate describes this episode quite well. Today, Socialist Action belongs to the Canadian Network on Cuba, and it's a solidarity network that was founded in 2002. Socialist Action joined in 2017. For 4 years, the Communist Party and its front organizations blocked the membership of Socialist Action in the Canadian Network on Cuba. It took an intervention by the Cubans to remedy the situation. The Communist Party, like several other organizations on the Canadian left, is generally hostile to collaboration with competing leftist parties, unless it's in the framework of an alliance that they dominate. The Venezuela Solidarity Coalition in Toronto is an exception to the rule, but Palestine Solidarity and the annual May Day celebrations confirm their pattern of sectarianism. The Labour May Day Coalition, in which Socialist Action participates, enjoys a multitude of union and socialist endorsements. It holds an annual online or in-person event to which hundreds are drawn. But the CP's May Day Committee holds a separate gathering that excludes speaking rights to all but its fellow travelers. Another example of Communist Party sectarianism is its attitude towards the labor-based New Democratic Party. The NDP is not a socialist party. It never has been, and likely it never will be, a socialist party. But it is the only mass labor-based political party in North America. It represents a working class break with the parties of big business, a step towards independent working class political action. By the way, in the United States, where there's no Labor Party, the Communist Party USA usually backs the big business Democratic Party, and it supported Joe Biden for president. It does not fight to build a Labor Party. In Canada, the Communist Party exhibits a strident hostility to the NDP. But why? Well, it's not just due to opposition to its reformist policies. After all, the CP is equally reformist. Contrary to Communist Party policy in the 1920s, to which John referred, which favored the formation of a Labour Party in Canada, actually helped to form one, the Canadian Party of Labour, the Communist Party is opposed to the very existence of the NDP because it stands in the way of the CP's dream of an alliance with left liberals. The NDP occupies an electoral space that the CP would like to occupy or share with the liberal left. In its program, the CP calls for, and I quote, an anti-monopoly government based on a parliamentary majority, close quote. That's from their electoral program. Well, that formulation embodies two big strategic errors. Firstly, there is no section of the Canadian capitalist class that is anti-monopoly, because in the current epoch of monopoly capitalism, that would entail being anti-capitalist. Capitalism and monopoly are inseparable. They go together like a horse and carriage. Secondly, an anti-capitalist government that bases itself on a parliamentary majority, is doomed to disaster, as we saw in Spain in 1936, in Indonesia in 1965, in Chile in 1972, and in many other places. An anti-capitalist government, that is, a workers' government, may have members of parliament. Quite possible, we don't exclude the likelihood of it. But it would need to base itself fundamentally on mass mobilizations of the working class. It would have to cultivate and secure itself on institutions of workers' power, on workers' councils in workplaces and communities, not on a parliamentary majority. Today's Communist Party does not call for a revolutionary break with the capitalist state. And that's the problem with most reformist currents. Instead, it seeks a reform of the state and a gradual transition to socialism. As all history teaches us, that road leads over a cliff to a deadly crash for the working class movement. Due to its commitment to reform of the state, the CP is for the subordination of national liberation struggles by Indigenous peoples, by the Quebecois and Acadians, to the preservation of the Canadian Federation. Revolutionary socialists, on the other hand, are for the breakup of the colonial settler state, the Canadian prison house of nations. We're for a red North America based on a free voluntary association of workers' states. Related to the Stalinist concept of class collaboration and its ongoing search in the enemy class camp for lesser evil partners is the error of campism. Campists divide the world into two camps. It is the United States versus the rest of the world. Campists, by reflex, support capitalist Russia and China. They back Turkey, Iran, and other repressive capitalist regimes simply because they are often in conflict with America's rulers. Revolutionary socialists defend self-determination for oppressed nations. We support the right of Syria, Venezuela, and Iran, for example, to get aid wherever they can to resist imperialist economic and military intervention. But revolutionaries give no political support to capitalist governments anywhere. Socialists oppose Washington and Ottawa's trade war with China because we oppose all inter-capitalist rivalries. We oppose the potential of Cold Wars to become hot wars and the existential danger of the nuclear annihilation of humanity. We are for socialist revolution everywhere, except in Cuba, where we support the revolutionary government that's in place. Revolutionary socialists oppose campism because it dulls the senses of the working class and breeds the subordination of workers to capitalist rule. Another example of the CP's reformism is its approach to the labor movement. It does not seek to defeat the conservative union bureaucracy. Rather, it seeks to join the bureaucracy. How? By allying with slightly left-of-center labor fakers. This was evident in the campaign of one Hassan Husseini, a CP supporter who ran for president of the Canadian Labour Congress in 2014. He pulled out of the race at the last moment to support Hassan Youssef, who proved to be a right-wing labor bureaucrat in office. The Workers' Action Movement, formed in 2015, is running a militant team of candidates for the top 4 positions in the CLC to be elected this June. But don't expect the Communist Party to support WAM's Labor Forward team of candidates this year. They didn't support the WAM candidates for leadership of the Ontario Federation of Labour, and those candidates received up to 36% of the votes at the OFL convention in November 2019. Our main goal is to build a movement up from the bottom up to replace the Labour and NDP bureaucracy and to fight for a workers' government. Socialist Action stands firmly in the tradition of the founders of communism in Canada. Socialist Action is not the only party that claims to be a revolutionary Marxist, but in our humble opinion, Socialist Action best represents the revolutionary continuity of the founders of Canadian communism, who charted the path for the united front, for international solidarity, and for genuine democracy in the workers' movement. And if you agree with that, well, there's only one thing to do, and that's to join Socialist Action. Thanks very much. I look forward to the questions.
Okay, thank you very much. Now, with the help of our technical producer, Kurt Young, we'll have some questions from our online audience. So we will take 3 questions and then go to our speakers, and they will have up to 7 minutes each to answer the questions. So Kurt, would you please put the questions in the chat?
Okay, so our first question comes from myself, and I ask, what was the stance on the original Communist Party of Canada on the occupation of Palestine? Rock McBean asks, can you comment on what, if any, persecution of communists happened in Canada at the same time as the McCarthy-era witch hunts in the USA? And Demand Better asks, how do we start to gain power relative to the liberal conservative establishment? We should run candidates in PEI where there is the highest writing to person ratio.
Okay, so Barry, we will go to you first, and then to John. You have up to 7 minutes.
Okay. Well, the communist movement has been opposed to the colonial settler state in occupied Palestine from the very beginning. In fact, the communist movement has been opposed to the colonial settler states all over the world, including the one that later established the apartheid system in South Africa. It was only under the influence of Stalinism that there was a retreat from these principled anti-imperialist working class policies. So in the case of Palestine, it's quite interesting that in 1948, when the United Nations voted to establish the State of Israel, to endorse the establishment of the State of Israel out of the British mandate, the Soviet Union supported that vote, voted yes to the establishment of the State of Israel. Now, you might wonder why. Well, part of it was a function of attempting to forge an alliance with the so-called, progressive bourgeoisie globally, to foster trade relations, to counteract the Cold War, and to try to foster, alliance with the so-called left in the capitalist states. There was also a notion that in the new state of Israel, the communists would have a sizable party, and they could perhaps form a government or at least a coalition with other parties to rule that colonial settler state. So Stalin ordered his emissaries to vote for the establishment of the state of Israel. And that, in fact, helped to facilitate the Nakba, the disaster. We're marking it now 73 years after the fact, when 750,000 Palestinians were forced out of their homes and out of their homeland, creating a huge diaspora. So that is to the everlasting shame of the degenerated communist movement. In fact, even today, the Stalinist parties, which supported the establishment of the state of Israel back in 48, 49, these parties still parade the completely utopian notion of a two-party solution to the dispute in occupied Palestine. There's no any Palestinian state. It's now clear. It was clear to us for a long time beforehand that any such Palestinian state would be little more than a Bantustan, subject to the strictures and the oppression of the Israeli nuclear-armed state alongside it. The persecution of communists in Canada in the 40s and 50s. Maybe John has some historical data to contribute in discussion of that. But I do know, I can't cite cases, that many communists lost their jobs. They were hounded out of industry. They were hounded out of union positions. The mine, mill, and smelter workers in Sudbury were isolated, and Stephen Lewis and the CCF played a particularly odious role in red baiting and trying to shunt the communist organizers and workers who supported a democratic union out of the mainstream of the labor movement. So there was persecution of communists at work, in the cultural arena, and in the labor movement, to which sadly the Social Democrats made a very prominent and heinous contribution. And as for running candidates to combat the liberals and conservative establishment, well, we want to do that, and we want to fight for socialist candidates, and we have an orientation in Socialist Action to running candidates at the municipal level. We plan to run candidates in the coming municipal elections this year and in 2022. So we're exploring those avenues, and we want to do it in partnership with other tendencies on the left across Canada from Atlantic to Pacific. But whether to run candidates in provincial or federal elections runs up against the problem of the United Front that the NDP represents, not only in theory but in practice. It is the party of the labor movement. And so at this stage, it's important to fight for socialist policies and socialist candidates and socialist leadership in the existing working class organizations, not only the unions, but the party to which the unions are affiliated, many of them, and that's the NDP. So we would push to organize the Socialist Caucus. In fact, we are doing that very actively in Atlantic Canada, in Quebec, in Ontario, and across the West, with the aim of emboldening workers to fight for a workers' agenda in the NDP and in the unions. When the time comes that tens of thousands of workers leave the NDP or are forced out of the NDP by the right-wing bureaucracy to constitute a revolutionary socialist labor movement, we hope to be, we expect to be in the forefront of that development, and it will stand independent candidates. But right now it's necessary to combat the right wing inside the existing organizations of the working class, the unions, and the labor-based NDP. So at the municipal level, we will run because the NDP does not, and at the other levels, we will continue to contest inside the working class organizations for a workers' agenda. Thanks.
Okay, John?
Okay, you can hear me?
Yes, I can.
Okay, now with regard to Palestine, you know the settler colonialization of Palestine was a British project. It was sponsored by the British government during the First World War, and the Communist International back in the day, in period 1920, 21, assessed the colonization of Palestine as just that, a form of colonialism that should be opposed as such. And for that reason, they didn't talk about it too much. It just was obvious. However, there was one conference of communists at that time that did discuss the issue, and it was the Baku Congress in 1920, a congress of 2,000 delegates from various parts of Asia. And the record of this Congress is present in this book, which I edited some time ago, called To See the Dawn. And it actually includes a debate on Zionism, that is on the project of establishing a settler colonial state on the historic land of Palestine. And there were delegates at the conference who defended the Zionist position, and they put forward, there were delegates from every conceivable point of view there. It was a very broad conference. They put forward a couple of working papers on this, and there was a response from Jewish labor organizations that opposed Zionism. And so that reinforced the communist position on the question. Now, on the question of McCarthyism and the victimization of leftists, socialists, communists in the 1950s, well, I agree with what Barry said. It was the correct description of what happened, so I'll just add a little bit of color. I first came acquainted with this when I was 9 years old, when I was listening to the CBC, which I did, very great lengths of time. I was fascinated by CBC radio at the time. And there was a program by a guy called Max Ferguson. You may remember if you're very, very old. He later performed on TV. And he had skits about political, and one of the sequence of skits was about screening. And screening was what you did to people who had jobs in the government, and you were thinking maybe you should fire them because they were leftists. And so the way he portrayed it was by creating the sound of gravel being rolled back and forth over a screen. And in the background with muffled cries, are the people who were being screened. I was 9 years old. I was totally horrified by this. And so I went and asked my parents what this was all about. And they explained to me, well, yes, actually, in a sense that they had been involved in this, because what they had a friend in Ottawa who was of Russian origin and who was under suspicion by the government, and who was harassed, and who was forced to quit her job, and had a sort of nervous collapse over this whole experience, and had great difficulty reestablishing herself. A little bit later, a guy called Herbert Norman, who was a diplomat of the Canadian government, who went to school with my dad way back in the 1930s. He was driven to suicide by the harassment of the McCarthyists in the United States. And so that had an impact on my family. Now, I don't say there's anything special about me. I say that in order to illustrate the fact that this thing was very widespread. And it affected a lot of people who were not directly involved in communism or anything like that, were just ordinary people doing their daily jobs. Now, what else? I just want to mention in passing that when Barry mentioned China as a capitalist state, now, I'd like to discuss that someday. I'm not so convinced. It seems more contradictory than that to me, and I think the pandemic illustrates it. But I'm not suggesting we discuss it now. That would be a diversion. Let's save it for another day. So I think I covered the questions. Stop there.
Okay, so yes, so Kurt, we'll go back to the questions. I think we're going to have 2 questions this time. So go ahead, put the 2 questions up.
Give me one moment as I prepare them.
Yes.
Okay, so Mark Kosatsky asks, how did Tim Buck build the Stalinist CP, which even today sells Stalin works at its functions, such as its 2017 celebration of the Russian Revolution. Matt Barnes asks, communism, socialism, and leftism are widely misunderstood due to active misinformation campaigns. Is it beneficial to push socialist, revolutionary, and political ideas under a different name?
Okay, we'll go to John first and then to Barry. You have up to 6 minutes each.
Well, how was it possible that Tim Buck was able to build the Communist Party as a Stalinist party? And the Communist Party indeed was very strong in the 1930s and 1940s. One thing was that there was a strength in the Communist Party leadership in the 1920s. It was not factionalized. It was generally a unified leadership. But there was that strength had also, if you will, a weakness. It was not easy to build a faction within the Communist Party. It wasn't their tradition. And in fact, when the different leaders that I mentioned declared against Stalin, they were shoved out one by one. And there was not a moment when there was sort of a unified struggle of these forces. So that was one factor. But another factor, and it was the main factor, was that the Communist Party was seen by its friends and by its enemies as representing the immense authority of the Russian Revolution and of the worldwide communist movement. And that continued and still continues to some extent today. And that gave the Communist Party an immense edge, in addition to the fact that it had considerable forces coming out of the period of its formation. So that in the 1930s, when there was a really widespread workers' radicalization that carried on in the 1940s, the Communist Party absolutely had the inside track on this. And in the working class, the Communist Party was, what shall I say, able to compete with the Social Democrats of the CCF, who later joined the NDP, to compete on an equal basis. Now, when this was broken, I think it was really broken by the experience of the Second World War. In the Second World War, the Communist Party was for the defense of the Soviet Union, which is understandable, but they were also for the defense of the Canadian bourgeoisie, and they favored an alliance with the Canadian bourgeoisie, and they would even support the Liberal Party against worker candidates in elections in that period. And in the unions, the Communist Party generally aligned with the most bureaucratized and more right-wing forces. And so for that reason, after the Second World War, it was possible for left-wing forces to establish their hegemony in the union movement. And also bureaucratic forces went along with this. See, and so the very bad reputation that this Communist Party had gained during the war as people who opposed strikes and so on, who opposed militant action, exposed them to being shoved aside and driven out of the leadership of the union movement in the 1940s. And that was the period in which the Communist Party lost its mass base in the working class. So I think I could leave it at that, but I think I've missed a question here. Have I?
You still have time, John, so just look at the questions.
I think I've covered it.
Okay. All right. Thank you, John. Barry?
Right. So thanks for those questions. I think John has analyzed the role of Tim Buck and the Communist Party. I think I would add only to that by saying that the Communist International went from being a democratic convergence of revolutionary socialists on a global scale in alliance with a healthy Russian Revolution that created the Soviet Union, to becoming a top-down dictatorial organization that subordinated the communist parties and the workers' movement in countries where the Stalinists had influence to alliance with the liberal bourgeois political parties, the liberal political forces. So in the case of the Communist Party of Canada, when the delegates came back from, I think it was the Fourth World Congress or the subsequent one, where they reported on the dispute over China, where the CP went from the Workers' United Front to supporting the bourgeois nationalist Kuomintang and opposing socialist revolution in China in favor of the nationalist course. When Maurice Spector and Jack MacDonald started to organize to circulate the documents of the left opposition to expose what decisions had been made by the Comintern in conflict with its historic program, they were banned. They were immediately prohibited from, discussion with the ranks. They were driven out, and they were, one by one. So they had to organize outside the party without any significant resources, and they were vilified, royally misrepresented, and besmirched. Their reputation was viciously attacked. So there was no fair hearing for their views, and it became clear to most members who stayed in the party that either you obey the Moscow line or you're out. You lose your friends. You might even lose your family because of the factional way in which the party operated, totally subordinated to Moscow, which had adopted a counter-revolutionary policy. Concerning the question about communism, socialism, and leftism being widely misunderstood, well, whatever terms we use to describe our movement for fundamental change, for an economic democracy, those terms will be misrepresented by the mainstream media and by the major institutions of bourgeois society, by the religious organizations, by the school system, by the popular press, and the major media corporations, including on the internet. So there'll be no reprieve for the revolutionary socialists. Changing the name is not going to change much. The rulers will still defend their system and attack those who criticize it by every and all means necessary. But it is heartening to note that these terms, communism, socialism, are much less vilified today than they were 20, 30, and certainly 40 or 50 years ago. In fact, opinion polls that have been conducted in recent years in both Canada and the United States show that a majority of people under the age of 35 prefer socialism to capitalism. Now, there's no certainty what they mean capitalism to be and what they understand socialism to be as the alternative to capitalism. It could be, classic revolutionary Marxism, or it could be some kind of social democratic critique or alternative to the neoliberal agenda, the capitalist agenda today. But whatever may be the case, for such a large percentage of opinion polls reporting people, who reject capitalism and who applaud or are open to or even embrace the socialist alternative, is indeed very, very encouraging. And why would this be the case? Well, first of all, the Cold War McCarthyite anti-communist propaganda has worn out, has dissipated to a large extent. In fact, it provokes laughter as much as it provokes hostility to the left these days. But there's another more powerful reason, and that has to do with the actual behavior of the capitalist system. It's characterized now by what I call the triple crisis of capitalism on a global scale. First of all, there's the environmental crisis. the obsession with carbon energy has, advanced not just the melting of the polar ice caps and rising sea levels, but a climate catastrophe, a change in weather patterns that has resulted in gigantic continent-wide forest fires, and very cold weather in some places and very, very hot and arid in other places. That's disrupting agriculture on a large scale and causing more people to have to flee their homelands for food and for the ability to survive. Then there's the economic crisis. We should remember that COVID started as a world recognized disease catastrophe, basically in March 2020. But in November, December 2019, there was already a rapidly advancing economic crisis, a great recession, another great recession. We have these great recessions, it seems, every 10, 12 years. And this one was worsened by the health crisis. But nonetheless, it's a feature of capitalist mode of production, overproduction of useless things, and underproduction of what humanity needs. And then there's the health crisis itself. And I don't think I need to say much more about that because we're still living through it in the third wave of the pandemic. So different name. Well, we're not hard committed to any particular name, but if you advocate solutions to the capitalist crisis of today, and you say, well, we need to initiate mass housing construction, we need to overhaul the transportation system, we need to safeguard the environment by supplanting the power of the resource corporations, we need a planned economy, we need public ownership and workers' control. The moment you articulate these demands, the more you say that workers should stand up and fight against two-tier wages, against the robbery of our pensions, against racism and sexism in the workplace, the bosses and their paid agents will immediately say, you're a communist, you're a socialist, you're a radical. So I don't think there's much traction in denying the terms and coming up with another term, which once you explain it, will simply be the target of the same accusations and the same hostility from the super rich and their minions. I think the terms are still serviceable. Socialism, communism. I mean, communism is a higher stage of socialism. We're trying to establish a workers' government that will end the dictatorship and the toxic environment that capitalism fosters in its late stage. And that's a workers' government by any other name. We're headed to a socialist transformation of society, and we shouldn't let the name deter us. Thanks.
Okay, thank you, Barry. Okay, so it's back to our producer for the last three questions, and the panelists will have up to 7 minutes each to respond. And we will start with Barry and then John. Kurt?
Okay, we have a first question coming from Judy Kosh. She asked, how did the CP under Stalin show its degeneration by continuing the oppression of women? Elizabeth asks, the CP claimed they significantly contributed to trade union organizing in Canada. They also say that they were active in anti-war and peace movements and other social movements. How true is this? And the man better asks, even the NDP and Greens are attacked for being too far left, so how do we win enough people over to communism to organize meaningfully? Can we ally with intermediary left parties who agree with us?
Okay, we'll start with Barry. That's 7 minutes.
Right. Well, the Communist Party has a particularly odious record where it concerns women, and for that matter, people who are gender non-conforming and who are gay, lesbian, or not what the church has defined as acceptable sexual relations. At the beginning of the Bolshevik Revolution and in the early years of the Soviet Union, marriage was made a private matter, and if two people wanted to marry, they would simply register their desire at the local city hall, and that's all that was required. If a woman wanted to terminate an unwanted pregnancy, she could get an abortion free of charge with the full cooperation of the medical authorities. Contraception was widely available as a matter of right, and homosexuality was no longer illegal. Relations between humans was made a matter of their choice without persecution. But Stalin reversed all of those policies. Abortion was made illegal. Marriage was not just a voluntary association. It was the influence of the church was restored to recognition of marriage, and contraception became harder to obtain. And part of it was motivated by the Stalinists in terms of the need to replace the population that was lost in World War I and in World War II. So women were assigned the task of replacing the population, and that meant no right to abortion, no right to contraception, no right to dignity and equality in the framework of a civil union. And gays and lesbians were persecuted. These policies persisted almost till the end of the Stalinist regime in the Soviet Union, and it's a great shame and scandal for the revolutionary socialist movement, which had its roots in women's liberation, socialist feminism, and gay rights. Concerning the NDP and the Greens being attacked for being too far left, well, it just shows you the lack of imagination in the mass media to attack the NDP and the Greens for being too far left. Really boggles the mind. I mean, these parties. I mean, the Green Party is all about green capitalism, making a profit from solar screens, and the NDP, has. I mean, it's hard to imagine, anyone being serious in suggesting that the NDP is too far left. People who would make these claims are basically, just hardline idolaters of the capitalist so-called free market, which is anything but. It's monopoly controlled, and is anything but free. The big fish eat the small fish every day of the week, reducing democracy in the market at a pace. So how can we ally with intermediary left parties who agree with us? Well, that's what we tried to do. We try to do that every day. And how do we try to do that? Well, in campaigns to raise the minimum wage. We in Socialist Action, through the Socialist Caucus of the NDP, fought successfully for a policy that commits the NDP to fight for $20 an hour minimum wage. Previously, it was $15 an hour, and it was out of tune with the cost of living and the changes that have occurred over the last 10, 15 years of that policy being in place. But we're able to work together with other leftists to fight for that, and to fight for Indigenous people's rights, and to oppose pipelines, and to stand up for an alternative to the carbon energy system, that is, for sustainable green alternatives, green energy alternatives. In defending Palestine today, where we see the flames of bigotry and oppression surging, Zionist atrocities against the Palestinian people, there are protests all around the world, and forces are coming together, except for those leftists who are apologists for Zionism. I can think of a couple, but I won't name names. We're working together with Palestinian youth, with Arab nationalists, with workers who are opposed to imperialism, who recognize that the enemies of Palestine are also the enemies of Venezuela and Cuba. And that's called the United Front, and that's how we can work with intermediary left parties, or just other forces in the labor and general left to affect change. We don't need to agree on everything. We can agree on just one particular cause and one particular set of policies to run socialist candidates for municipal government as an alternative to the liberals and Tories who run things at the city level for the big developers and land speculators. There's a lot we can do to address housing, to address the crisis in long-term care. We recall for nationalization, for long-term care to be a feature of Canada's public health care system. We can ally with intermediary forces on all of these issues and many, many more in terms of the environment, democratic rights, defending the right to strike, defending the right of the dock workers whose right to strike was violated by the Liberal government, which claims to be feminist. But there are many forces in the labor movement and beyond who want to stand up for the dock workers, who want to stand up for the postal workers whose strike 2.5 years ago was violated, their strike rights. So let's work together. We don't have to agree on everything. And through our experience working together to achieve specific and winnable goals, we can establish a new currency, not only for the United Front, but for socialist policies that will transform our society. Thanks.
John?
Most of the discussion here has been around the question of how the party evolved, the Communist Party evolved after it had gone Stalinist. Am I not heard? Can you hear me?
Yes,
we
of
can.
course.
Okay, I'm sorry. Okay, but I'd like to go back to what the focus of my presentation was. That is not how the Communist Party became Stalinist, but how is it formed? I think there's a particular importance to that, because what happened was that some socialist groups who had a lot of problems managed to come together and build a party. That's kind of our task. Well, I don't say we have that many problems, but the others certainly do. And of course, it's a matter of opinion. And so the way that this happened is worth thinking about. For example, the fact that groups that were very divided on left politics in Canada came together around a very big international issue. And the fact that they managed to learn from this experience around the world. Their internationalism was the basis of their ability to unify. Also, the fact that the group, which was the smallest but had the broadest vision, was able to dominate the whole process. Well, I won't go through my talk again, but I think there's a lot in that for us to think about. Now, on the Communist Party, again, I will just say that what my experience was with the Communist Party when I met it, which is 2/3 of the way back from now to its formation. So it's a long time ago. I went to a May Day meeting called by the Communist Party and found outside it a young guy distributing some political literature, and he was set upon by some kind of a guard or goon or something and beaten up. His papers were taken, and he was denounced noisily as a fascist. Later turns out that was a member of the League for Socialist Action called Harry Payne. I knew him well. Well, after I went into the meeting, there were about 2,000 people there because the Communist Party still had forces. And afterwards, I went up to the stage and accosted Tim Buck, who was alone, as it happened, and asked him to explain to me what the Communist Party thought of the overthrow of the revolution in Hungary. A very provocative question. Well, he was actually patient with me. I don't think it was very often they had 16-year-olds come up and accost them on anything those days. It was rather a reactionary period. But anyway, so we had a discussion, and I heard what he had to say and was not too convinced. But interestingly, he did not introduce me to anybody and did not try to get my phone number, which in those days was the key way to maintain contact. So after that, I went to the Communist bookstore, and they had some pamphlets, basic writings by Marx and Engels and Lenin, which I could pick up for about 10 or 15 cents each, or if it was a thick one, I'd pay a quarter. And so I went again and again and kept buying these things. But the person in the store never asked my name, never take my phone number or anything like that. And finally, when I had bought everything I could buy for a quarter, I said, you know, these other things you have, I really can't afford it. You don't have a lending library by any chance? He said, no, we don't lend out books. And so I walked out of the store and never walked back again. That was the end of my contact with the Communist Party. My gosh, how enclosed that is, you know, how sectarian, how lacking in the elementary capacity to reach out to people and link up with what they're thinking and feeling. Now, we had that problem in the anti-war movement. The Communist Party was good on anti-war questions up to a point. That is, they would form coalitions, but only of their own friends and supporters. They would not allow into the coalition anyone like me, for example, who belonged to another socialist current. But this was an enormous barrier, that the movement could grow to a certain point, that of the Communist Party in its periphery, but couldn't grow beyond that. Well, around the war in Vietnam, we were able to break through that. And we were able to, basically by organizing on the campuses, we of the League for Socialist Action were able to set up anti-war committees that were broad enough and strong enough so that the Communist Party had to come in. By the way, during one of these united, peaceable, and happy meetings of the different currents, a guy punched me out, knocked me out flat on the floor. He took offense to something I'd said. He was a Stalinist. He was not from the Communist Party, he was from the Maoist wing. But it reminded me of the incident of assaulting that guy with the newspaper, that there was something about violence in this political tradition. Nonetheless, the initiative of the 60s in being able for the first time to have truly united actions carried over in the years that followed. And for example, in that period in the 60s, it was impossible to defend Cuba in the framework of a single committee. Oh no, the Communist Party had to have their own committee and other people had to organize separately. Eventually this was overcome. And the defense of Cuba now in Canada is done in a unified way. The different groups, different points of view are able to work in a common framework. This is an immense progress. And I'm very pleased from that point of view, and I'm able to be part of coalitions now that include the Communist Party as well as other organizations. This is a tremendous step forward and something that we should prize. So I think I'll leave it at that.
Okay, thank you. Well, we still have a few minutes left. It's the end of our questions. Still have a few minutes left, so I'd like to go back to the panel. First to John and then to Barry, maybe for a 3-minute wrap-up. Now, John, you did touch on a part of my question that I asked about the anti-war and peace movement as far as the CP is concerned. But nobody talked about the labor movement, because in my union, I was used to CPers telling me that, that they were the end all to everything we've ever gotten. It was all through them. So I would like to hear a little more, because neither of you touched on that. If you could do that in your wrap up, I would appreciate it. So John, you got 3 minutes if you wish, and then Barry's got 3.
I have not had direct experience with the Communist Party and the trade unions. And so I don't think I'm in the best position to answer this question, although I think it is an important question. So I'd like to leave that one to Barry. And so I'd like to say something. Oh, I forgot. The series of books that I co-edit on the Communist International is coming out with a book on the Communist Women's International. That is a movement of communist women in the 1920s that was led in Canada by, and had a Canadian affiliate, or rather an affiliate in Canada. So in any case, we're putting out a book of the proceedings of conferences of communist women in the time of Lenin, and it will be available it's at the printer now, will be available next year, and will be a good basis to investigate the question about the oppression of women and how it was dealt with in the early communist movement. So that's not an answer. That's just a promise that we have something coming. Now, there's also the question of how we approach the question of history. Now, in a discussion like this, we come at it from an uneven basis. See, you've got many comrades who have only a recent connection with the history of the workers' movement. And they run into people like me who've been around for several centuries, and are very inclined to say, oh, this is the way it was, this is the way it was, and this is what we did, and you better listen to what I say. And it sounds a little bit like a put down. And I think the important thing here is that when we talk about the history of the workers' movement and the history of socialism, we should try to do it in a way that enables people who didn't live all that history and haven't read all that history to become familiar with it and to be able to explain it themselves. That is not a top-down approach towards history, but one which enables people to become protagonists in the sense of being spokespersons and interpreters of the history themselves as something that we can all interpret. Now, this was the purpose of the project to publish the documents of the Communist International, which I initiated 38 years ago, and has produced a whole pile of books with several to come. The point of the books was that if you picked up one of these books, it might be somewhat big and heavy and all that, but nonetheless, you would find in it everything you needed to know. That is what people said, how they said it, the arguments they got into, what was going on behind the scenes, the documents, the official documents, and also the unofficial documents. And you would be fully equipped to have an opinion on this stuff. It is important that we know our history very well. But I think also that's the way to know it. And work towards that. And I hope that this modest discussion tonight has been a step in that direction. So I'll hand this over to Barry. And since this is, I guess, my last word, I could say how delightful it is to be with you tonight and to participate in this discussion.
Thank you, John. Thank you. Barry?
Yeah, I want to take the opportunity to answer a question that was posed earlier. I just shunted it aside and ran out of time. And it's about the record of the Communist Party with respect to the anti-war movement. There's some pretty heated debates in the movement against the war in Vietnam. When I first became politically active as a high school student and as a university student, participating in the Vietnam Mobilization Committee, which was led by the League for Socialist Action in Toronto and by similar organizations across the country. And I had difficulty understanding why the Communist Party didn't participate in the VMC and why it participated only on the fringes of the big demonstrations, and why its literature seemed to emphasize a different point of departure for the movement. Well, it was all about the debate concerning which perspective or slogan should lead the movement forward in a principled fashion. Well, the demand of the United Anti-War Movement was for out now. It said that U.S. troops, and for that matter, Canadian forces that were allied to the United States through the International Control Commission and through NATO and NORAD, should get out now. The slogan was out now. U.S. and allied forces have no place in Southeast Asia or anywhere for that matter outside of the territory of their own countries with respect to determining the future of other people. Out now was the demand of the United Anti-War Movement. But what was the position of the Communist Party? The position of the Communist Party varied, but it took the form of slogans like set the date or go to Paris and negotiate a withdrawal of forces from Southeast Asia. And this was perplexing. And as the anti-war movement argued at the time very convincingly, the imperialists have no right to be anywhere in Southeast Asia or in any other country where they're interfering with the right of people to self-determination. So setting the date was inappropriate, or the Paris Peace Accords, or the shape of the table for the negotiations around those accords in Paris was completely beside the point. We should give no credence or backhanded support to the idea that the imperialists should have any say in the war in Vietnam or in Southeast Asia. Get out now. But the Communist Party took the opposite position, put conditions on the withdrawal, and gave credence to the imperialist intervention, and that was, I thought, quite unacceptable. The Communist Party and the unions. What is its role? Well, the Communist Party, as I said in my talk earlier, is a shell of its storied past. What its storied past included, the work of organizing coal miners in Nova Scotia, of rallying and organizing the On to Ottawa trekkers, the unemployed workers in the dirty 30s who fought for relief, who fought for work to survive under those inhumane conditions, standing up for the Estevan miners, and for other workers who went on strike under very difficult conditions to establish the right to have a union and to advance a workers' agenda. But this all was sacrificed when the Communist Party veered sharply to the ultra left and targeted Social Democrats as the main enemy, and then veered sharply to the right in the Popular Front era, in which they actually in the 1940s advocated a no strike policy. That's right. They said, and I think John mentioned this, they said at the time that the workers should not go on strike because it would disrupt the war against Nazi Germany. And so there should be unity with the bosses to increase production and to loyally defend the interests of imperialism in the war. Well, they didn't say imperialism, but that was the
30 seconds.
So the Communist Party really frittered away its credibility in the labor movement, adopted a sectarian position in relation to the NDP to the present. At the Ontario Federation of Labor Convention in the 1980s, the host of this show, Elizabeth, advocated at the microphone a general strike to defeat the goods and services tax. And the Communist Party had two speakers at other mics, and they actually opposed it. They criticized it. They condemned it. And yet the convention voted nearly unanimously in favor of a general strike to fight the goods and services tax. The Communist Party doesn't support WHAM or any initiatives from the left, and that's to its shame. And that's why it is being superseded by the forces of the radical left in the labor movement. And that's what we invite you to join us to help build the Workers' Action Movement, the Labor Forward Slate, and fight for socialist future in the labor movement, in the workers' movement, and all the allied social movements for a clean and sustainable environment. Join Socialist Action. Thanks very much.
Okay, special thanks to both of you, John and Barry, and of course Kurt, our producer. Please consider being a supporter of Socialist Action newspaper, which we will send to you online. And to fill out the form, just visit our website at www.socialistaction.ca. And if you would like to talk to us about joining SA, write to socialistactioncanada at gmail.com, or just give us a call at 647-986-1917. That's 647-986-1917. Once again, folks, if you like this show, please subscribe to the Socialist Action YouTube channel. Our next essay webcast will be on Thursday, May the 20th, and it's going to be a really good show. It's going to be, as I said, Thursday, May the 20th, 7 p.m. Eastern Time, and the topic is Canadian Labour Congress at a Crossroads. What does WHAM want? With the Labour Forward candidates for the CLC Executive, Julius R. Scott for President, Jenny Esnard for Executive VP, Sandra Griffith Bonaparte for Executive VP, and Harold Marcotte for CLC Secretary Treasurer. On May the 20th, see what the CLC, that's the Canadian Labour Congress, would look like under new militant leadership offered by the Workers' Action Movement, better known as WHAM. I also draw your attention to a special online event this Saturday, May 15th at 1 p.m. Eastern Time. It is the 73rd anniversary of the Nakba, the disaster that led to the displacement of 700,000 Palestinians from their homes and homeland in 1948 by the violent actions of the then new Zionist apartheid state. So this Saturday, May 15th, there will be a cross-Canada action for Palestine, featuring speakers and performers from as far away as Gaza. Look for the link and join the rally on Saturday. In the meantime,